Captain Alexandra Lexa Matthews had always been exactly what the Air Force wanted. At 28, she flew the F-22 Raptor with a precision that made seasoned pilots shake their heads in admiration. Her record was spotless, her test scores legendary, and her ability to stay calm under pressure had earned her a reputation that stretched from Nellis to the Pentagon. But none of that mattered to Colonel Richard Hawthorne. Lexa first noticed something was wrong during her third week at the Pacific Forward Operating Base. She had just completed a flawless high-altitude reconnaissance mission, bringing back intelligence that would reshape the entire operation. As she climbed out of her cockpit, still buzzing with adrenaline, she expected the usual debrief with the mission commander. Instead, Colonel Hawthorne was waiting for her on the tarmac. He was a tall man with steel gray hair and eyes like winter storms. His uniform was pressed to perfection, every ribbon aligned with mathematical precision. At 52, he commanded respect through a combination of experience and an intimidating presence that made junior officers stumble over their words. "Captain Matthews," he said, his voice carrying across the flight line despite the roar of nearby jets. "Walk with me." Lexa fell into step beside him, her flight helmet tucked under her arm. The evening air was thick with humidity and jet fuel, but something else hung in the atmosphere, tension she couldn't quite place. "Your flight today," Hawthorne began, not looking at her as they walked. "The reconnaissance package. You deviated from the prescribed route." Lexa's brow furrowed. "Sir, I followed the mission parameters exactly. The deviation was a tactical adjustment to avoid a weather system that would have compromised the imaging. The deviation was unauthorized." His tone was flat, matter-of-fact. "In my command, pilots fly the routes they're given. No exceptions." She stopped walking. Around them, ground crews continued their work, but she felt suddenly isolated in the middle of the bustling flight line. "Colonel, the intelligence we gathered because of that adjustment has already been flagged as mission-critical by analysis. The storm system would have made the original route impossible." Hawthorne turned to face her fully. His expression was unreadable, but there was something cold in his eyes that made her stomach tighten. "Captain, let me be very clear. I don't care if you found the location of every enemy asset in the Pacific. You will fly the routes you're assigned, when you're assigned to fly them, exactly as briefed. Is that understood?" The words hit her like a physical blow. In 8 years of service, no commanding officer had ever questioned her judgment in the cockpit. Her tactical decisions had saved lives, completed impossible missions, and earned commendations from generals she'd never even met. "Sir, with respect, tactical flexibility is essential for..." "Dismissed, Captain." The conversation was over. Hawthorne turned and walked away, leaving Lexa standing alone on the tarmac as the sun set behind the mountains. She watched his retreating figure, a knot of confusion and frustration building in her chest. That night, in her quarters, she tried to make sense of what had happened. She pulled out her mission files, reviewing every detail of the flight. The deviation had been textbook perfect, a necessary adjustment that any pilot with her experience would have made. The intelligence gathered had already been forwarded to 3 different command levels. Yet Hawthorne had treated it like a failure. She thought about calling her mentor back at Nellis, Colonel Patricia Reeves, who had guided her through flight school and her early assignments. But something held her back. This was her first major command assignment, her chance to prove she belonged in the most elite circles of military aviation. Running to her old instructor at the first sign of trouble felt like admitting defeat. Instead, she decided to give Hawthorne the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he was under pressure from higher up. Maybe there were aspects of the command structure she didn't understand yet. Maybe this was just his way of establishing authority with a new pilot. The next morning brought her second mission assignment. As she reviewed the flight plan in the briefing room, she noticed something odd. The route was unnecessarily complex, taking her through areas of known turbulence that would stress both pilot and aircraft for no tactical advantage. When she approached the mission planner, a young lieutenant named David Park, he shrugged apologetically. Orders from the top captain, Colonel Hawthorne, specified this exact route. No deviations authorized. The emphasis on those last three words was unmistakable. Word had already spread. Lexa flew the mission exactly as planned. She fought through turbulence that rattled her teeth and pushed her Raptor through unnecessary fuel burn that left her running on fumes by the time she landed. The mission objective was accomplished, but barely, and the stress on her aircraft was significant enough that maintenance flagged it for additional inspections. When she submitted her post-flight report, she included a detailed analysis of the route inefficiencies and suggested improvements for future missions. It was standard practice, the kind of after-action feedback that helped improve operations across the board. The report came back the next day with a single word written across it in red ink: declined. Below that, in Hawthorne's precise handwriting, pilot recommendations are not requested or required. Fly the missions as assigned. That evening, as Lexa sat in the officers' club nursing a beer she didn't really want, she overheard a conversation. At the next table, two senior pilots were discussing the new colonel, their voices low but not quite low enough. "He's got something against female pilots," one of them was saying. "You see what he did to Captain Rodriguez last month? Rodriguez transferred out, didn't she? Transferred out after he made her life hell for 6 weeks. Same pattern every time. Impossible missions, constant criticism, no support from command. Eventually they break or they leave." Lex's blood went cold. Captain Maria Rodriguez had been one of the most respected pilots in the Pacific Theater, a veteran with 12 years of experience and a safety record that was legendary. If Hawthorne had driven her out, she thought about her own situation, the way Hawthorne had dismissed her judgment, the unnecessarily difficult missions, the refusal to consider her input. A pattern was emerging, and she was starting to understand that her perfect record and exemplary service meant nothing to her new commanding officer. What she didn't understand was why. As she walked back to her quarters that night, Lexa made a decision. She wasn't going to run, and she wasn't going to break. If Colonel Hawthorne wanted to play games, she would learn the rules and play them better than he ever imagined. She just didn't know yet how high the stakes would go, or how far he was willing to push to get what he wanted. But she was about to find out, and it would start with a mission that should have been routine, but would instead become a fight for survival that would test everything she thought she knew about command, loyalty, and what it meant to serve. The war wasn't just in the sky anymore. It was right here on the ground, and Lexa was about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous enemy was the one wearing the same uniform. The missions kept coming, each one more demanding than the last. Captain Lexa Matthews found herself assigned to flights that pushed both her skills and her aircraft to their limits, often for objectives that seemed deliberately obscure. While other pilots flew standard patrol routes or escort missions, she was sent on solo reconnaissance runs through contested airspace. A Raptor loaded with sensors, but stripped of the support that would make the mission safer. 3 weeks after her first confrontation with Colonel Hawthorne, Lexa was reviewing her flight schedule when she noticed something that made her stomach drop. She was assigned to fly every day for the next 2 weeks, including missions that would require her to be in the air for maximum duration flights that would push her beyond normal fatigue protocols. She found Lieutenant David Park in the mission planning office, hunched over a computer terminal with dark circles under his eyes. "David," she said quietly, pulling up a chair beside him. "This schedule you sent me. There's got to be a mistake." Park glanced around nervously before leaning closer. "It's not a mistake, Captain. Direct orders from Colonel Hawthorne. He said you requested additional flight time to, quote, prove your commitment to the mission. Lexa felt her jaw clench. I never requested anything like that. I know. Park's voice was barely above a whisper. Look, Captain, I've been doing mission planning for 4 years. This schedule, ... is not safe. The fatigue factors alone put you in violation of at least 3 different flight safety protocols. Then why are you processing it? Park's expression was pained. Because when I tried to flag the safety concerns, Colonel Hawthorne called me into his office personally. He made it very clear that my job was to plan the missions he assigned, not to question his judgment about pilot capabilities. A cold realization washed over Lexa. Hawthorne wasn't just making her life difficult, he was systematically isolating her from the support structure that kept military aviation safe. By making subordinates afraid to raise legitimate concerns, he was creating an environment where dangerous decisions couldn't be challenged. David, she said carefully, has he done this to other pilots? Park's silence was answer enough. That afternoon, Lexa flew her assigned mission a high altitude surveillance run along the edge of disputed territory. The flight itself went smoothly, but as she was preparing to return to base, she received an unexpected communication from the control tower. Raven 27, you are directed to extend patrol for an additional 90 minutes. Investigate possible surface contacts at coordinates being transmitted now. Lexa checked her fuel levels. An additional 90 minutes would put her at the absolute minimum for safe return, with no margin for error. Control, Raven 27. Fuel status requires return to base within 60 minutes for safe landing parameters. There was a pause. Then a different voice came over the radio. Colonel Hawthorne's voice. Raven 27, this is Base Command. You will investigate the coordinates as directed. If you are unable to complete assigned missions due to fuel planning deficiencies, that will be noted in your performance evaluation. The implication was crystal clear. She could refuse the unsafe mission and face career-damaging criticism, or she could accept the risk and hope everything went perfectly. It was a choice no pilot should ever have to make, and they both knew it. Lexa took a deep breath, calculating distances and fuel burn rates in her head. There was technically enough fuel if everything went exactly right. No headwinds, no tactical detours, no unexpected complications. Base Command, Raven 27. Roger, extending patrol as directed. She flew the extended mission, every mile stretching her fuel reserves thinner. When she finally landed, her Raptor was running on vapors, the fuel warning lights glowing red on her dashboard. The margin for error had been so thin that a 5-minute delay would have forced her to attempt a dead-stick landing. As she climbed out of her cockpit, she found Chief Master Sergeant Thomas Anderson waiting for her. Anderson was a 30-year veteran who had worked on every fighter jet in the Air Force inventory. His weathered face was grim as he watched the fuel truck approach her aircraft. Captain, he said quietly, mind if I ask what your fuel state was when you touched down? Below minimums, Chief. Way below. Anderson nodded slowly, his expression darkening. That's the 3rd time this month. I've seen one of your birds come back running on fumes. That's not coincidence. Chief, Ma'am, Anderson interrupted gently. I've been working this flight line since before you were born. I've seen good pilots pushed until they made mistakes, and I've seen those mistakes kill people. Whatever's going on between you and the Colonel, it's putting you and my aircraft at risk. The Chief's words hit harder than any criticism from Hawthorne. Anderson represented the backbone of military aviation, the experienced enlisted personnel who kept the planes flying and the pilots alive. If he was concerned, the situation was worse than she had realized. That night, Lexa couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling and thinking about fuel margins and safety protocols and the growing list of near misses that were becoming routine. She thought about Captain Rodriguez, who had transferred out rather than continue fighting. She thought about the other female pilots she'd heard whispers about, all of whom had either left the unit or been forced into ground assignments. Around midnight, she made a decision. She got up, dressed quietly, and walked across the base to the communication center. Using her security clearance, she accessed the base's personnel database and began researching Colonel Hawthorne's command history. What she found made her blood run cold. In every command assignment over the past 8 years, Hawthorne had overseen a significant decrease in female pilot retention. At his previous base, 4 experienced female aviators had requested transfers within a 6-month period. Before then, 2 had been grounded for safety violations that seemed suspiciously minor when compared to similar incidents involving male pilots. The pattern was clear, but it was also subtle enough that it had never triggered an official investigation. Individual incidents could be explained away as coincidence or legitimate command decisions. It was only when viewed as a whole that the discrimination became obvious. But obvious wouldn't be enough. She needed documentation, evidence, proof that would stand up to scrutiny from higher command. And getting that proof would mean surviving long enough to gather it, which was becoming increasingly uncertain with each mission. As she walked back to her quarters, Lexa passed the base hospital. Through the lit windows, she could see medical personnel treating a pilot who had been brought in earlier. She didn't know the details, but she had heard the emergency sirens, had seen the ambulance racing across the tarmac. It could have been her. With the margins Hawthorne was forcing her to accept, it probably would be her, eventually. But as she reached her door, Lexa felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks. Determination. She had spent her entire career being the perfect pilot, following orders without question, trusting that the system would protect her if she just did her job well enough. That wasn't working anymore. It was time to change tactics. She didn't know it yet, but tomorrow would bring the mission that would finally push her past the breaking point. And when that happened, she would discover resources and allies she didn't know she had, along with a strength that came not from following orders, but from knowing when those orders were wrong. The real battle was just beginning. The mission. Briefing came at 0500 hours, delivered by a stone-faced intelligence officer who looked like he hadn't slept in days. Captain Lexa Matthews sat in the sterile briefing room, surrounded by empty chairs that should have held other pilots, other perspectives, other voices of experience. Instead, she was alone with the intelligence officer and Colonel Hawthorne, who watched her with an expression that might have been anticipation. "Your target area is here," the intelligence officer said, pointing to a section of ocean that looked identical to every other section of ocean on the map. Recent satellite imagery suggests possible submarine activity. You'll conduct a solo reconnaissance sweep, maximum altitude, maintain radio silence until mission completion. Lexa studied the coordinates. The target area was at the extreme edge of her fuel range, assuming perfect conditions. But the weather report showed a storm system moving through the area, which would require tactical adjustments that would burn additional fuel. "Sir," she said carefully, "the weather conditions in that sector are deteriorating. Request permission to adjust the mission timeline to account for." "The mission timeline is fixed," Hawthorne interrupted. "Launch is scheduled for 0700 hours. Mission duration is exactly 4 hours and 30 minutes. No deviations." The numbers didn't work. Lexa had run the calculations 3 times, factoring in every variable she could think of. Even with optimal flight conditions, the mission as briefed would push her fuel consumption beyond safe limits. With the storm system factored in, it became genuinely dangerous. "Colonel, With respect, the fuel margins for this mission are adequate for a competent pilot flying a properly planned route, Hawthorne finished coldly. Unless you're suggesting you're not capable of handling your aircraft efficiently. The challenge was implicit but unmistakable. Question the mission parameters and face questions about her own competence. It was a trap that had probably been set for every female pilot who had served under Hawthorne's command. But Lexa had been analyzing his patterns for weeks now, and she was beginning to understand his methodology. He never gave orders that were explicitly suicidal that would trigger investigations he couldn't control. Instead, he created situations where following orders required accepting unacceptable risks, then framed any objection as pilot inadequacy. "I'm capable of flying any mission within safe parameters," she said evenly. "My concern is that the weather conditions may require tactical adjustments that weren't accounted for in the fuel planning." Hawthorne's smile was razor-thin. "Then I suggest you fly more efficiently." 2 hours later, Lexa was strapped into her F-22 Raptor running through pre-flight checks with a knot of dread in her stomach. Chief Anderson had reviewed her fuel load personally, his weathered face grim as he calculated the same number she had. "Captain," he said through her helmet cum as the canopy lowered, "if you run into weather, you come home." Mission be damned. She wanted to acknowledge his advice, but Hawthorne was monitoring radio communications. Instead, she simply nodded and gave Anderson a thumbs up. The flight began routinely. The Raptor performed flawlessly, cutting through the morning air with the precision that made it the most advanced fighter jet in the world. But as Lexa approached the target area, the storm system that had been a distant concern on the weather maps became a towering wall of black clouds that stretched from sea level to the stratosphere. She had two choices: fly around the storm, which would add at least 20 minutes to her flight time and guarantee a fuel emergency, or fly through it, accepting the risks of severe turbulence and possible aircraft damage. Either choice violated different aspects of flight safety protocols. Either choice could kill her. For a moment, she considered turning back. She could claim equipment malfunction or medical emergency, anything to justify aborting the mission. But she knew Hawthorne would demand proof, would order investigations, would use any excuse to question her fitness for duty. Then she remembered something Chief Anderson had told her weeks earlier. Sometimes the safest thing to do is the most dangerous thing to do. She flew into the storm. The next 30 minutes were the longest of her life. The Raptor was thrown around like a toy, subjected to turbulence that pushed both aircraft and pilot to their limits. Lightning flashed around her, close enough that she could feel the electromagnetic interference affecting her systems. Rain hammered the canopy so hard that visibility dropped to nearly zero. But she held course, fought through the storm, and emerged into clear skies above the target area. The reconnaissance sweep went smoothly, her sensors gathering the intelligence that had been requested. She even spotted what might have been the submarine activity mentioned in the briefing, a shadow beneath the waves that appeared and disappeared too quickly to be certain. Then, as she turned for home, her fuel computer delivered the news she had been dreading. The storm passage had burned more fuel than her most pessimistic calculations. She was now below the minimum required for safe return to base. She tried to raise the control tower, but her radio systems had been damaged during the storm passage. Only static came through her headset, broken by occasional fragments of distant conversations that faded before she could respond. Lexa was alone, flying a damaged aircraft with insufficient fuel over an ocean that stretched empty in every direction. The situation was exactly what every pilot feared most: multiple system failures with no backup and no support. That was when the missile lock alarm began screaming in her helmet. Unknown aircraft had appeared on her scope, moving fast and aggressive. The targeting radar was painting her with the electronic signature that preceded weapons launch. She had seconds to react, with a damaged aircraft and no support. In that moment, everything Hawthorne had put her through crystallized into a single, burning certainty. This wasn't poor planning or excessive zeal or misguided leadership. This was attempted murder, disguised as a routine mission. But Lexa Matthews had not survived 8 years of military aviation by giving up when things got difficult. She had survived by being smarter, tougher, and more determined than anyone expected. The missile launch came as a streak of light across her canopy. She dumped countermeasures, dove toward the storm clouds, and began flying for her life. The enemy aircraft pursued, but they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated their target. For the next 20 minutes, Lexa fought a running battle against superior numbers with a damaged aircraft and almost no fuel. She used every trick she had learned, every advantage her training had given her, every ounce of skill that had made her one of the Air Force's most elite pilots. When the missile finally struck her aircraft, it was because her fuel had run out and her options had been exhausted. But even then, she didn't give up. She rode the dying Raptor down through the storm, fought to control an uncontrollable descent, and managed to crash land on a remote island rather than disappearing into the ocean. As she crawled from the wreckage, battered but alive, Lexa realized that surviving the crash was only the beginning. She was stranded, possibly behind enemy lines, with hostile forces actively hunting for her. But she was also free from Hawthorne's command structure for the first time in months. And in that freedom, she was going to find a way to ensure that what had happened to her never happened to anyone else. The real fight was just beginning, and this time, she was going to set the rules. Captain Lexa Matthews had been missing for 18 hours when Chief Master Sergeant Thomas Anderson decided to break protocol. He sat in his maintenance office, surrounded by the familiar sounds of the flightline aircraft engines, hydraulic systems, the constant chatter of ground crews, but his attention was focused on a manila folder that shouldn't have existed. For the past 3 months, Anderson had been keeping his own records. Every time one of Lexa's missions came back with fuel levels that violated safety protocols, he had documented it. Every time her aircraft required additional maintenance after unnecessarily stressful flights, he had noted the details. Every suspicious mission parameter, every dangerous flight plan, every instance where standard safety procedures had been mysteriously overridden. The folder contained evidence of systematic harassment that had endangered both pilot and aircraft. But Anderson knew that evidence alone wouldn't be enough. Not against a full colonel with a spotless service record and powerful connections. What he needed was someone who could act on that evidence, someone with the authority and courage to challenge Hawthorne directly. That someone walked into his office at 1400 hours, wearing the silver eagles of a full colonel and an expression that could have cut steel. Colonel Patricia Reeves had flown combat missions over 3 different war zones, commanded 2 fighter squadrons, and earned the respect of every pilot who had ever served under her. She was also Lexa's former mentor and the closest thing to a mother figure the younger pilot had ever known. "Chief Anderson," Reeves said without preamble, "I understand you have concerns about Captain Matthews' recent mission assignments." Anderson had been expecting this conversation since news of Lexa's disappearance had reached the Pentagon. He had worked with enough senior officers to recognize the ones who genuinely cared about their people, and Patricia Reeves had always been at the top of that list. "Yes, ma'am," he said, gesturing for her to take a seat. "And I have documentation to support those concerns." For the next hour, Anderson walked Reeves through the folder, explaining each entry with the methodical precision of a man who had spent decades making sure aircraft and pilots returned safely from their missions. Reeves listened without interruption, her expression growing darker with each revelation. "This is attempted murder," she said finally. her voice quiet but filled with controlled fury. "He's been systematically pushing her toward a fatal accident." "Yes, ma'am, and Captain Matthews isn't the first. I've been asking around, talking to chiefs at other bases where Colonel Hawthorne has served. The pattern goes back years." Reeves closed the folder and looked directly at Anderson. "Chief, what I'm about to tell you cannot leave this room. Captain Matthews is alive. Her survival beacon activated approximately 6 hours ago, but her location is in contested territory. Colonel Hawthorne has classified the rescue mission as low priority, claiming that available resources are needed for more critical operations." Anderson felt his blood pressure spike. "Ma'am, that's unconscionable." "Yes, I know." Reeves stood up, pacing to the small window that overlooked the flight line. "Which is why I'm here unofficially. I've been authorized to conduct a preliminary investigation into Captain Matthews' mission assignments, but I suspect that won't be enough to save her life." "What do you need from me, Colonel?" Reeves turned back to face him. "I need you to help me build a case that's so airtight, so thoroughly documented, that even Hawthorne's supporters won't be able to ignore it. And I need you to help me do it fast, because every hour we waste is another hour she's stranded out there." While Anderson and Reeves worked to build their case, Lieutenant David Park was fighting his own battle with conscience and fear. For months, he had watched Hawthorne's systematic harassment of Lexa, had processed mission plans that violated basic safety protocols, had remained silent while a fellow officer was placed in increasingly dangerous situations. Now she was missing, possibly dead, and Park knew that his silence made him complicit in whatever had happened to her. That evening, after most of the base personnel had gone to their quarters, Park made his way to the communications center. Using his security clearance, he accessed the mission planning database and began copying files, electronic records of every dangerous mission Lexa had been assigned, every safety protocol that had been waived, every instance where standard procedures had been mysteriously modified. The files painted a clear picture of systematic harassment, but they also revealed something else. Hawthorne had been careful to ensure that his orders appeared legitimate on paper. Every dangerous mission had been justified by intelligence requirements or operational necessities. Every safety waiver had been accompanied by documentation claiming pilot concurrence. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic manipulation, designed to deflect blame if anything went wrong. The orders would show that Lexa had been given challenging but legitimate assignments. The documentation would suggest that she had agreed to accept the associated risks. If she died, it would appear to be the result of pilot error or simple bad luck, but Park had been in the room when many of those orders were given. He had heard Hawthorne's tone, had seen Lexa's reluctant acceptance of missions she knew were dangerous. He understood the difference between voluntary risk acceptance and coercion disguised as choice. The question was whether he had the courage to speak up, knowing that doing so would end his career and possibly result in criminal charges for unauthorized access to classified information. The answer came when he remembered Lexa's face during their last conversation, the quiet resignation of someone who knew she was being set up to fail but couldn't find a way to fight back. Park copied the files to an encrypted drive and began composing a detailed statement that would corroborate everything Anderson and Reeves were documenting. It was professional suicide, but it was also the right thing to do. Meanwhile, in his private quarters, Colonel Hawthorne was fielding phone calls from Washington. News of Lexa's disappearance had reached senior Air Force leadership, and questions were being asked about the circumstances surrounding her mission. The mission was routine reconnaissance, Hawthorne told his superior, Admiral James Crawford, Director of Pacific Air Operations. Captain Matthews is an experienced pilot. Equipment failure or pilot error are the most likely explanations for the incident. Colonel, Crawford's voice came through the secure phone line with the authority of someone who had commanded thousands of personnel across multiple combat zones. "I've reviewed the mission parameters. That flight was at the extreme edge of fuel and weather safety margins. Why wasn't she assigned backup support?" Hawthorne had prepared for this question. "Sir, Captain Matthews specifically requested solo assignment to prove her capability for independent operations. She felt that previous missions with support aircraft had limited her ability to demonstrate her skills." It was a lie, but it was the kind of lie that would be difficult to disprove. Military personnel were often ambitious, often eager to take on challenging assignments to advance their careers. The claim that Lexa had requested the dangerous mission would be believable to anyone who didn't know the full context. But Crawford wasn't convinced. "Colonel, I'm ordering a full investigation into Captain Matthews' recent mission assignments. Until that investigation is complete, you are not to authorize any high-risk solo flights for female pilots under your command." The conversation ended with Crawford's directive hanging in the air like a threat. Hawthorne knew that his carefully constructed system of harassment was about to face its first serious scrutiny. The question was whether he could deflect that scrutiny long enough to ensure that the evidence disappeared and the witnesses remained silent. What he didn't know was that Anderson, Reeves, and Park were already several steps ahead of him, building a case that would be impossible to suppress or explain away. And somewhere in the Pacific, on a remote island where she was supposed to have died quietly and conveniently, Lexa Matthews was very much alive and very angry. The investigation that would destroy Hawthorne's career and expose years of systematic discrimination was already underway. The only question was whether it would move fast enough to save Lex's life and prevent him from destroying evidence or silencing witnesses. The clock was ticking, and the stakes had never been higher. Admiral James Crawford arrived at the Pacific Forward Operating Base at 0600 hours, 2 days after Captain Lexa Matthews had been declared missing in action. His unannounced inspection caught Colonel Hawthorne completely off guard, which was exactly what Crawford had intended. Crawford had spent his 30-year career distinguishing between officers who made tough decisions in difficult situations and officers who abused their authority to cover personal agendas. Everything about Hawthorne's recent communications had raised red flags that demanded immediate investigation. The first stop was Chief Anderson's maintenance office, where Crawford found a folder of documentation that painted a damning picture of systematic harassment disguised as operational necessity. The second stop was Lieutenant Park's mission planning desk, where encrypted files revealed a pattern of deliberately dangerous assignments that violated multiple safety protocols. By noon, Crawford had enough evidence to end Hawthorne's career, but he also had something more valuable: a growing network of personnel who were ready to testify about what they had witnessed. "Colonel Reeves," Crawford said as he reviewed the documentation in the base commander's conference room, "how long have you known about this situation?" Patricia Reeves sat across from him, her service records spread on the table between them. 3 decades of exemplary service, multiple combat deployments, and a reputation for integrity that was unquestioned throughout the Air Force. "Sir, I suspected problems when Captain Matthews stopped calling me for advice," Reeves replied. In 8 years of service, she had never gone more than 2 weeks without checking in. "When she went silent for over a month, I knew something was wrong." "And you began investigating on your own initiative?" "Yes, sir. I contacted Chief Anderson initially, just to get a sense of how she was performing. What I found was a pilot who was being systematically pushed toward a fatal accident." Crawford nodded grimly. The evidence was overwhelming, but there was still one crucial element missing: Lexa herself. Until she was found and could provide her own testimony, Hawthorne could claim that everything had been misunderstood, that his actions had been legitimate command decisions. That changed when the rescue beacon activated. The signal came through Pacific Command at 14:30 hours, a steady electronic pulse from coordinates that placed Lexa on a small island approximately 200 miles northwest of her last known position. The beacon indicated she was alive, mobile, and actively trying to communicate with friendly forces. Crawford was in the communications center when the signal was received. He watched as the technician tried to establish voice contact, calling Lexa's designation repeatedly without response. "Sir," the technician said after several minutes of attempted contact, "the beacon is active and moving, but we're not getting voice response. Could be equipment damage or atmospheric interference." Crawford studied the coordinates on the display screen. The island was in contested territory, officially neutral, but known to be used by various military and paramilitary forces as a staging area for operations. A rescue mission would be complex and potentially dangerous. "What's the standard protocol for beacon activation in that area?" Crawford asked. "Sir, normally we would launch immediate search and rescue with full air support," the technician replied. "But Colonel Hawthorne has classified this as a low-priority recovery due to other operational commitments." Crawford felt his jaw clench. Even with Lexa confirmed alive, Hawthorne was still trying to delay her rescue, probably hoping she would die of exposure or enemy action before she could provide testimony about her mission assignments. "Delay that classification," Crawford said, with the authority of flag rank behind his voice. "This is now a Priority 1 recovery operation. I want a full rescue package airborne within 2 hours." 20 minutes later, Crawford found Hawthorne in his office, surrounded by files and looking like a man who was running out of options. "Colonel," Crawford said without preamble, "Captain Matthews' beacon is active. She's alive and awaiting rescue." Hawthorne's face went through several expressions before settling on what might have been relief. "That's excellent news, Admiral. I'll coordinate with search and rescue immediately." "No need. I've already authorized the mission." Crawford took a seat across from Hawthorne's desk. "Now, let's discuss why it took a direct order from me to launch that mission." For the next hour, Crawford systematically dismantled every excuse and justification Hawthorne offered. The conversation was recorded, as were all official inquiries, which meant that Hawthorne's responses would become part of the permanent record. "Colonel, I've reviewed Captain Matthews' mission assignments for the past 3 months," Crawford said, sliding a folder across the desk. "Every single mission pushed safety margins beyond acceptable limits. The fuel calculations alone represent criminal negligence." Hawthorne opened the folder, his face paling as he recognized his own mission authorizations. "Admiral, these missions were assigned based on operational requirements. Captain Matthews never objected to, because objecting would have ended her career, and you both knew it." Crawford's voice was cold with controlled anger. "You created a situation where she had to choose between accepting dangerous missions or facing career-ending fitness evaluations. Sir, I resent the implication that you'll resent it more when you're facing a court-martial." Crawford interrupted. "Colonel, you have systematically endangered the life of one of the Air Force's most skilled pilots through a pattern of harassment that violates every principle of military leadership." The weight of those words settled over the room like a physical presence. Hawthorne's carefully constructed facade was crumbling, and both men knew it. "Furthermore," Crawford continued, "I have testimony from multiple personnel indicating this is not an isolated incident. Your command history shows a pattern of female pilot attrition that defies statistical probability." Hawthorne's hands trembled slightly as he closed the folder. "Admiral, if there have been misunderstandings about my leadership style, there have been no misunderstandings. There has been deliberate, systematic discrimination disguised as operational necessity." Crawford stood up, his presence filling the small office. You are hereby relieved of command pending a full investigation by the Inspector General. You will confine yourself to quarters and speak to no one about this matter without legal counsel present." As Crawford walked out of Hawthorne's office, he felt a mixture of satisfaction and disgust. Justice was finally being served, but it had taken far too long and nearly cost an exceptional pilot her life. The rescue mission was already underway, and within hours, they would have Lex's own testimony to complete the case against Hawthorne. But Crawford knew that the real victory wouldn't be Hawthorne's downfall. It would be ensuring that no other pilot ever faced the same systematic harassment again. Meanwhile, on the island where she had crashed, Lexa was preparing for her own rescue in a way that would shock everyone involved. She had used her survival time not just to stay alive, but to gather intelligence about the forces that had shot her down. When the rescue helicopter arrived, she would have more than just testimony about Hawthorne's harassment. She would have proof that the routine reconnaissance mission had been anything but routine, and that someone had wanted her dead badly enough to coordinate with enemy forces to make it happen. The investigation was about to become much larger and much more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The Black Hawk helicopter approached the island coordinates with the caution of a crew that had learned to expect the unexpected. Captain Rebecca Torres, the rescue pilot, had reviewed Lex's service record during the flight and knew they weren't extracting just any pilot. They were rescuing someone whose disappearance had triggered an investigation that was already sending shockwaves. Through Pacific Command, Raven 27, this is Rescue 1. Torres transmitted on the emergency frequency. We have your beacon. Can you provide status and location for pickup? The response came not over radio, but as a precisely timed infrared laser pulse from a ridge overlooking the crash site. The beam blinked in a pattern that every military pilot recognized. Friendly forces, safe for approach, but maintain caution. Torres brought the Black Hawk in low, following the terrain contours that would minimize their exposure to potential threats. As they crested the final ridge, she could see the wreckage of Lex's Funny 2 scattered across a small clearing, its broken frame already being reclaimed by the jungle. But what caught her attention was the movement near the tree line. Figures in tactical gear were positioned in a defensive perimeter, their weapons trained outward rather than toward the approaching helicopter. It took Torres a moment to realize what she was seeing. Lexa hadn't just survived the crash. She had somehow taken control of the enemy forces that had been hunting her. The extraction was swift and professional. Lexa emerged from the jungle with 4 prisoners bound and gagged, their equipment carefully documented and tagged as evidence. She moved with the controlled precision of someone who had spent the past 48 hours fighting for survival and winning. "Captain Matthews," Torres said as Lexa climbed aboard the helicopter. "Are you injured?" "Negative," Lexa replied, settling into a seat near the door. "But these men are foreign nationals operating sophisticated jamming equipment on what's supposed to be neutral territory. Someone coordinated my mission to put me in range of their weapons." Torres felt her blood chill. If Lexa was right, the implications went far beyond Colonel Hawthorne's harassment. Someone had actively collaborated with enemy forces to arrange her death. During the flight back to base, Lexa provided a detailed debrief that painted a picture of a sophisticated ambush. The enemy forces had known her exact flight path, had positioned jamming equipment to disrupt rescue communications, and had been prepared for a specific type of aircraft flying at a specific altitude. The intelligence was too precise to be coincidental, Lexa explained to Torres and the crew. Someone with access to my mission planning provided detailed information to hostile forces. This wasn't random enemy action. This was targeted assassination, disguised as combat loss. When they landed at the forward operating base, Admiral Crawford was waiting on the tarmac along with Colonel Reeves and a team of intelligence specialists. The prisoners were immediately taken into custody, their equipment transported to a secure facility for analysis. But it was Lex's own testimony that provided the most damaging evidence against Hawthorne. In the base commander's conference room, with recording equipment running and legal counsel present, Lexa methodically described 3 months of systematic harassment, dangerous mission assignments, and increasingly desperate attempts to force her into a fatal accident. "Admiral," she said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion evident in her eyes, "Colonel Hawthorne didn't just want me to fail. He wanted me to die. The missions he assigned were designed to push me beyond safe operational limits while maintaining plausible deniability about the risks involved." Crawford leaned forward. "Captain, do you have evidence that Colonel Hawthorne coordinated with the forces that attacked you?" "Not direct evidence, sir, but the timing is suspicious. The enemy forces were positioned exactly where my mission would take me, at exactly the time I would be most vulnerable due to fuel constraints. Either that's an incredible coincidence, or someone provided them with detailed intelligence about my flight plan." Colonel Reeves spoke up from her position near the recording equipment. "Captain, in your professional opinion, could the mission parameters have been designed specifically to place you in that vulnerable position?" Lexa considered the question carefully. "Yes, ma'am. The fuel margins, the timing, the route, all of it forced me into a predictable pattern that would be easy to intercept. If someone wanted to arrange a combat loss that looked accidental, that mission was perfectly designed for it. The implications hung in the air like smoke. If Lexa was correct, they weren't just dealing with harassment and discrimination. They were looking at conspiracy, treason, and attempted murder on a scale that reached far beyond one base commander's personal prejudices. Crawford made a decision that would transform the investigation from an internal Air Force matter into a joint military intelligence operation. "Captain Matthews," he said formally, "you are hereby placed on protected status pending completion of this investigation. You will be transferred to a secure facility where you can provide detailed testimony without fear of retaliation or further attacks." Then he turned to his aide. "Contact the FBI and CIA immediately. We need joint investigation teams here within 12 hours. This is now a matter of national security." As the meeting broke up, Crawford pulled Reeves aside for a private conversation. "Patricia," he said quietly, "how many other pilots has Hawthorne commanded over the years?" "Dozens, sir. And if we're right about his methods, some of the accidental losses in his previous commands may not have been accidents at all." Crawford nodded grimly. The investigation that had started as a harassment complaint was becoming something much larger and much more horrifying. If Hawthorne had been systematically murdering female pilots for years, using his command authority to arrange their deaths, the scope of his crimes was almost unimaginable. But there was still one crucial question that needed to be answered. Had Hawthorne been acting alone? Or was he part of a larger conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of military command? The answer to that question would determine not just the fate of one corrupt colonel, but the integrity of the entire military justice system. And somewhere in the secure facility where he was supposedly confined to quarters, Richard Hawthorne was making phone calls to people who had a lot to lose if the investigation continued. The real battle was just beginning. The joint investigation team arrived at dawn. 3 black SUVs carrying FBI agents, military prosecutors, and intelligence specialists who had been briefed on the most sensitive aspects of the case. Admiral Crawford met them at the base entrance, his expression grim, as he outlined the scope of what they were investigating. "Gentlemen," Crawford said as they gathered in the secure conference room, "what started as a harassment complaint has become a potential conspiracy involving treason, murder, and collaboration with foreign intelligence services. Captain Matthews is prepared to provide detailed testimony. But first, We need to secure all evidence before it can be destroyed or manipulated. Special Agent Maria Santos, the FBI's lead investigator, reviewed the preliminary files that Crawford's team had prepared. Santos had spent 15 years investigating corruption in military and government circles, and she recognized the patterns of a sophisticated cover-up operation. "Admiral," Santos said, "based on what I'm seeing here, Colonel, Hawthorne has been operating with support from someone higher up the chain of command. The mission authorizations, the safety waivers, the resource allocations, none of this could have been accomplished by a single base commander acting alone." Crawford nodded. "That's our assessment as well. We believe there's a network of personnel involved in systematic elimination of female pilots who were perceived as threats to a particular command structure." The investigation team split into specialized groups. One team focused on analyzing the electronic intelligence gathered from the enemy forces Lexa had captured. Another began reconstructing the financial and communication records of everyone involved in her mission planning. A third team started reviewing the service records and death circumstances of every female pilot who had served under Hawthorne's command over the past decade. But the most important interview was with Lexa herself. She sat in the secure conference room, still wearing her flight suit, speaking with the calm precision of someone who had processed trauma and converted it into determination for justice. For 3 hours, she provided detailed testimony about every suspicious incident, every dangerous mission, every moment when she had felt that her life was being deliberately endangered. "Agent Santos," Lexa said as the interview neared its conclusion, "I need you to understand that this wasn't just harassment. This was systematic attempted murder. Ogrina. Colonel Hawthorne was trying to kill me in a way that would look accidental, and he nearly succeeded." Santos leaned forward. "Captain, do you believe Colonel Hawthorne was working with the enemy forces that shot you down?" "I believe someone provided them with detailed intelligence about my mission. Whether that was Hawthorne directly or someone he was working with, I can't say. But the coordination was too precise to be coincidental." That afternoon, the investigation team made their move against Hawthorne. They found his quarters empty, with signs of hasty departure. His computer had been wiped clean, his personal files destroyed, and his secure communication devices missing. Crawford felt his jaw clench as he surveyed the empty room. "He's running," someone warned him. Agent Santos was already on her radio, coordinating with base security and external law enforcement. "All exits are sealed. He can't have gotten far." But Hawthorne hadn't run. He had gone to the one place on base where he felt safe, the command bunker, surrounded by personnel who still believed in his authority and might be willing to protect him. The confrontation came at 1600 hours, when Crawford and the investigation team arrived at the bunker to find Hawthorne barricaded inside with 3 loyal subordinates. The situation had escalated from investigation to potential hostage crisis. "Colonel Hawthorne," Crawford's voice echoed through the bunker's communication system, "you are ordered to surrender yourself for questioning immediately." Hawthorne's response came through the same system, his voice strained but defiant. "Admiral, this investigation is based on the lies of a failed pilot who crashed her aircraft due to her own incompetence. I won't be railroaded by politically motivated accusations." Crawford felt a surge of anger at hearing Lexa described as a failed pilot. The woman had survived situations that would have killed most experienced aviators, had fought her way through systematic harassment, and had still managed to complete every mission assigned to her. "Colonel, we have documented evidence of your harassment campaign, witness testimony from multiple personnel, and physical evidence of collaboration with enemy forces. Surrender now, and you may avoid additional charges." There was a long pause before Hawthorne responded. When he did, his voice carried a tone that made everyone listening feel cold. "Admiral, you have no idea how deep this goes. The people I work for have resources you can't imagine. If you continue this investigation, you'll be endangering national security and the lives of personnel at every level of command." Crawford exchanged glances with Agent Santos. Hawthorne had just confirmed their suspicions about a larger conspiracy, but he had also revealed something else. He was prepared to use threats against other personnel to protect himself. "Richard," Crawford said, using Hawthorne's first name. Deliberately, "it's over. We have the evidence, we have the witnesses, and we have the enemy intelligence you helped coordinate. The only question now is whether you face justice quietly or make this worse for everyone involved." The standoff continued for 2 hours. During that time, the investigation team used electronic surveillance to monitor Hawthorne's communications, discovering that he was indeed in contact with other conspirators who were frantically trying to coordinate a cover-up operation. But the most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. Lieutenant David Park, who had been quietly documenting Hawthorne's communications for months, had managed to preserve recordings of conversations that revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. "Agent Santos," Park said, as he handed over the encrypted drives, "these recordings show Colonel Hawthorne coordinating with at least 4 other senior officers to arrange accidental deaths for female pilots they considered problematic. Captain Matthews wasn't the first target. She was just the first one skilled enough to survive." The recordings were devastating. They revealed a network of senior military personnel who had been systematically murdering their own people to maintain what they called operational integrity and command structure stability. Armed with this evidence, Crawford made his final appeal to Hawthorne. "Richard, we have the recordings. We know about the network. We know about the other pilots. Surrender now and cooperate with the investigation. It's your only chance to avoid a death sentence." The bunker fell silent for several minutes. Then, slowly, the heavy doors opened, and Hawthorne emerged with his hands raised, followed by his 3 subordinates. As military police placed him in restraints, Hawthorne looked directly at Crawford with an expression of cold hatred. "This won't end with me," he said quietly. "The people who matter will make sure of that." Crawford met his gaze without flinching. "The people who matter are the pilots you tried to murder, and they're going to see justice served." As Hawthorne was led away, Crawford felt a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. They had captured one of the conspirators, but his final words suggested that the network was larger and more powerful than they had imagined. The investigation was far from over, and the people responsible for years of systematic murder were not going to surrender quietly. But for the first time in months, Crawford felt hope. They had broken the conspiracy's secrecy. They had evidence that would stand up in court, and they had witnesses who were ready to testify regardless of the personal cost. Most importantly, they had Captain Lexa Matthews, alive and determined to ensure that justice was served for all the pilots who hadn't been as fortunate as she had been. The real battle was just beginning, but now they had a chance to win it. 6 months after her crash, landing on a remote Pacific island, Captain Lexa Matthews stood in the witness box of a military courtroom, facing a panel of judges who would determine the fate of not just Colonel Richard Hawthorne, but an entire conspiracy that had reached into the highest levels of military command. The courtroom was packed with personnel from across the Air Force, including dozens of female pilots, who had come to show their support. Admiral Crawford sat in the front row, next to Colonel Patricia Reeves and Chief Master Sergeant Thomas Anderson. The media had been excluded, but everyone present understood they were witnessing a historic moment. Lexa wore her dress blue uniform, her ribbons and decorations telling the story of 8 years of exemplary service. She had been promoted to major during the investigation, a recognition of both her exceptional piloting skills and her courage in exposing the conspiracy that had nearly killed her. Major Matthews, the lead prosecutor said. "Please tell the court about your final mission under Colonel Hawthorne's command." For the next 2 hours, Lexa provided detailed testimony about the systematic harassment she had endured, the increasingly dangerous missions she had been assigned, and the final flight that had been designed to result in her death. Her voice remained steady throughout, professional and precise, but everyone in the courtroom could hear the underlying strength that had carried her through months of persecution. When she described the moment her aircraft was hit by enemy missiles, the courtroom fell completely silent. "The attack was coordinated," she testified. "The enemy forces knew exactly where I would be, exactly when I would be most vulnerable, and exactly what type of countermeasures my aircraft carried. That level of intelligence could only have come from someone with access to classified mission planning." The defense attorney, a civilian lawyer who had been hired by unknown benefactors, attempted to portray Lexa as a disgruntled pilot who had fabricated evidence to cover her own failures. But his attacks were methodically dismantled by the prosecution, who presented electronic evidence, witness testimony, and documented proof of the conspiracy. Lieutenant David Park testified about the mission plans he had been ordered to create, plans that violated basic safety protocols. Chief Anderson testified about the maintenance records that showed systematic stress being placed on Lexa's aircraft. Colonel Reeves testified about the pattern of female pilot attrition under Hawthorne's command. But the most damaging testimony came from the enemy operatives that Lexa had captured on the island. Under interrogation, they had revealed detailed information about the intelligence they had been provided, intelligence that could only have come from within the U.S. military command structure. Agent Maria Santos presented the FBI's findings, which had uncovered a network of 17 senior military personnel who had been systematically eliminating female pilots they viewed as threats to traditional command structures. The conspiracy had been operating for over a decade, responsible for at least 12 deaths that had been classified as accidents or combat losses. "Your Honor," Santos testified, "this was not a case of individual harassment or discrimination. This was organized murder, carried out under color of military authority, with the deliberate intent of maintaining gender-based exclusion from elite aviation units." The trial lasted 3 weeks. When it ended, Colonel Richard Hawthorne was found guilty of conspiracy, treason, attempted murder, and collaboration with enemy forces. He was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. 16 other senior officers received sentences ranging from 10 years to life, depending on their level of involvement in the conspiracy. But for Lexa, the most important moment came after the verdicts were announced, when Admiral Crawford approached her outside the courtroom. "Major," Crawford said, "the Air Force owes you an apology that can never adequately address what you endured. But we also owe you our gratitude for having the courage to expose this conspiracy and prevent future deaths." Lexa nodded, accepting the words but knowing that the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the policy changes that had already been implemented across the Air Force, the new oversight procedures that would prevent similar conspiracies from forming, and the cultural shift that was slowly making military aviation safer for everyone. "Admiral," she said, "I didn't survive that crash to get revenge on Colonel Hawthorne. I survived to make sure that no other pilot would have to face what I faced." Crawford smiled. Which brings me to my next point. The Air Force is creating a new position, Inspector General for Aviation Safety and Equal Opportunity. The job involves investigating suspicious patterns in pilot assignments, ensuring that safety protocols are followed, and serving as an advocate for personnel who face harassment or discrimination. We'd like you to consider the position. Lexa looked around the courthouse steps, where dozens of pilots were still gathered, many of them women who had served under commanders like Hawthorne and survived through skill, luck, or simple endurance. She thought about the pilots who hadn't been as fortunate, whose deaths had been classified as accidents when they were actually murders. "I accept," she said simply. 1 year later, Major Alexa Matthews submitted her annual report on aviation safety and equal opportunity. The statistics told a story of dramatic improvement. Female pilot retention rates were at historic highs. Suspicious accident patterns had been eliminated, and reports of harassment or discrimination were being investigated promptly and thoroughly. But the most meaningful change wasn't in the statistics. It was in the culture. Female pilots no longer flew in isolation, no longer accepted dangerous assignments without question, no longer remained silent when they faced harassment or discrimination. The conspiracy that had nearly killed Lexa had been designed to maintain an old system where power was concentrated in the hands of men who viewed women as threats to be eliminated. But in trying to destroy one exceptional pilot, they had instead created a catalyst for change that transformed the entire institution. Lexa kept the wreckage of her F-22 Raptor on her desk, a twisted piece of metal that reminded her of how close she had come to becoming another accidental casualty. But she also kept letters from young female pilots who were entering the Air Force in an environment where their skills and dedication would be evaluated fairly, where their safety would be protected, and where their voices would be heard. The real victory hadn't been in court. It had been in the change that followed, the knowledge that future generations of pilots would fly in an air force that honored merit over prejudice and valued all personnel regardless of gender. Sometimes the most important battles were fought, not in the sky, but on the ground, not with weapons, but with courage, persistence, and an unwavering commitment to justice. And sometimes, the greatest victory was simply ensuring that the fight never had to be fought again. As she looked out the window of her office at Peterson Air Force Base, watching young pilots prepare for their training flights, Major Alexa Matthews knew that her crash landing on that remote island had been the beginning, not the end, of her most important mission. The sky was safe now. For everyone. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.